The Alpha and Omega Protocol, the data-dense architecture of the Hebrew timeline, the math of the Messiah. Chapter 1, the Alpha and the Cosmic War. Chapter 2, the math of the Messiah. Chapter 3, the Israel anomaly. Chapter 4, the pivot point, church versus temple. Chapter 5, the Omega and the final countdown. Chapter 2, the Messiah matrix. The forensic anchor. Throughout this investigation, we will refer strictly to the ancient Hebrew record. These are the documents that later became the Old Testament. We use this terminology deliberately because our first question is purely historical and forensic, not theological. These are ancient writings preserved through thousands of years of copying, translation, and transmission. Before asking what they mean spiritually, an intelligent mind must first ask historical questions. When were they written? How were they preserved? Do they accurately reflect the world they claim to describe? One of the biggest objections to be encountered in secular academies is vaticinium ex eventua, Latin phrase meaning prophecy written after the event. The hypothesis is simple. If a prediction is incredibly accurate, it wasn't a prediction at all. It was backdated by a clever scribe after the dust had already settled. This is the standard defense mechanism used against the Book of Daniel. Skeptics frequently argue it must have been written long after the events it describes, perhaps even modified during the Christian era. The problem with this hypothesis is that the manuscript data completely refutes it. Daniel was already translated into Greek within the Septuagint, LXX, a translation produced in Alexandria around 285 to 250 BCE. Furthermore, multiple fragments of the Book of Daniel were discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, safely dated by paleography and carbon testing to the 2nd century BCE. This provides an unshakable historical anchor. Even by the most aggressive, hyper-skeptical secular dating, the words of Daniel 9 were locked in ink centuries before Jesus of Nazareth was born. There is zero baseline possibility of hindsight editing. The data was frozen in the historical record long before the endpoints occurred. The anomaly of the archive. Before analysing the raw math of this countdown, we have to address a more basic historical question. Why did this particular obscure people group preserve these specific records? The ancient world was crowded with massive dominant superpowers, Egyptians, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks and Romans, all boasting expansive wealth, vast military dominance, and highly financed creation mythologies. The Hebrew people were a microscopic demographic by comparison. They were routinely conquered, exiled, and subjugated. Yet their writings outlived the empires that crushed them, becoming the most influential collection of texts in human history. Why? Because the Hebrew tradition was fundamentally unique. It was a society built entirely around the preservation of a written record. Unlike Egyptian or Babylonian royal inscriptions, which existed solely as high-budget propaganda to glorify their kings and hide their defeats, the Hebrew records are brutally honest. They meticulously documented their own national failures, systemic corruption, military losses, and moral bankruptcies. They preserved texts that openly criticized their highest leaders. More importantly, these records constructed a highly continuous intergenerational storyline, creation to fall to the Abrahamic vector, to the Exodus, to the covenant, to the sacrificial system, to the prophets, to the expected restoration. The logic of the Lamb. To understand why the numbers in Daniel matter, you have to understand the symbolic framework they are attached to. During the post-Exodus wilderness period, Israel constructed the tabernacle, a highly geometric portable sanctuary. The architecture of the tabernacle communicated a stark physical reality. A holy, infinite God could dwell among humanity, but human wrongdoing created a lethal structural separation that had to be legally addressed. At the dead center of this system was the lamb. In surrounding pagan religions, animal sacrifice was treated as a crude bribe to purchase the favor of a volatile, localized deity. The Hebrew record explicitly rejected this. Instead, its system of sacrifices was designed to teach important ideas that wrongdoing has consequences, justice matters, someone can take the punishment for another, and a person can be declared innocent because of that sacrifice. The daily systemic offering of an unblemished lamb was a graphic data lesson. It established a clear pattern. A substitute could absorb the lethal consequences of a broken covenant. For centuries, the lamb sacrifice was central to Israel's national life, but the text itself left an open question. The prophets hinted that these repeated animal rituals were not the final solution, but merely shadows, placeholder code, pointing toward a grander historical fulfillment. As the prophet Isaiah wrote in his 53rd chapter, "He was led as a lamb to the slaughter. He bore the sin of many." Daniel's prophecy is not an isolated magic trick prediction. It sits directly inside this multi-millennial Hebrew storyline, providing a rigid numerical countdown to the arrival and the termination of that ultimate lamb. The 173,880-day chronology skeptics are entirely used to vague poetic prophecies like those of Nostradamus or modern astrology, which can be retrofitted to mean absolutely anything. Daniel 9 stands as a devastating anomaly to that skepticism because it delivers a rigid, testable mathematical countdown based on a specific ancient calendar system. In Daniel 9:25, the record states that from the issuing of a specific decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem unto the arrival of the Messiah, the prince would be exactly 7 weeks and 62 weeks, a total of 69 weeks. In the original Hebrew text, the word translated as week is shabuim, which literally means a 7 of years. A septim, just as a decade means 10 years. Therefore, the equation is straightforward. 69 weeks times 7 years equals 483 prophetic years. To audit this equation, we must use the standard calendar unit of the ancient Near East, as verified internally within the Genesis flood logs and externally via Babylonian records. The ancient prophetic calendar utilizes a standardized 360-day year, 12 30-day months, rather than our modern 365.242 2-day solar year. When we calculate the total day count of the protocol, the data becomes incredibly 69,483 years times 360 days equals 173,880 days. To test this metric against secular history, we turn to the forensic audit compiled by Sir Robert Anderson, the legendary former head of the Criminal Investigation Department, CID, at Scotland Yard. To establish an airtight case, Anderson mapped the timeline between two undisputed historical anchors. The start trigger. Daniel dictates that the countdown initiates at the going forth of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. While Persian kings issued multiple decrees regarding the temple, secular history records only one decree that authorized the reconstruction of the actual city walls and defensive streets. The royal decree of Artaxerxes Longimanus, issued on March 14, 445 BCE, recorded in Nehemiah 2. The math execution: if you advance exactly 173,880 days from March 14th, 445 BCE, accounting precisely for the shift from BCE to CE, leap years and solar deviations, you land directly on April 6th, 32 CE, the end trigger according to the historical accounts of the gospel narratives, specifically Luke 19. April 6th, 32 CE marks the exact date of the triumphal entry, Palm Sunday. This was the singular highly specific day where Jesus of Nazareth systematically broke his lifelong policy of secrecy, mounted a donkey, and publicly allowed himself to be heralded as the royal Messiah of Israel, telling the shocked religious elite that if the crowds were silenced, the very stones would be forced to cry out because they were accountable to know this your day. Luke 19:42. Framing this as a literal day countdown to the exact week of Christ's execution presents a massive hurdle for a rationalist. It cannot be hand-waved away as a vague coincidence. The post-countdown disasters. The predictive precision does not stop at the termination of the 173,880 days. Daniel 9:26 explicitly details a specific sequential aftermath that must take place after the 69th week concludes, but before the mysterious 70th week ever begins. The Messiah will be cut off, executed, but not for himself. The people of a prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. Observe the chronological sequence. First, the Messiah is publicly executed, mirroring the crucifixion where the ultimate lamb was cut off for the sins of others. Second, the city of Jerusalem and its holy sanctuary, the temple, are completely obliterated. Secular history records that in 70 CE, exactly 38 years after the execution of Jesus, the Roman legions under Titus breached the walls of Jerusalem, slaughtered the population, and burned the second temple to the ground. If the ancient Hebrew record were merely a collection of loose campfire myths, how did it successfully sequence a precise day count to a messianic presentation, accurately forecast that figure's execution, and correctly predict the total architectural annihilation of the Second Temple by a future empire decades later? The chronological intermission. The reality of the temple's destruction introduces a profound structural puzzle that brings us directly to the concept of the prophetic stopwatch. A sharp reader will immediately notice a logical constraint. If the 70th week immediately followed the 69th week with no intermission, all 70 weeks would have concluded by 39 CE. However, Daniel 9:27 explicitly dictates that the final 70 week begins with a covenant with many and features a distinct midway point, 3.5 years in, where sacrifices and offerings are forced to cease. Here is the problem. If the historical temple was completely leveled by Rome in 70 CE, there is no temple or sacrificial ecosystem left to be halted in the middle of a continuous timeline. Therefore, the architecture of the text itself structurally demands an interval of unmeasured time between the end of the 69th week and the activation of the 70th week. The execution of the Messiah and the Roman destruction of the temple occur entirely within this blank space, the gap. The prophecy explicitly notes that the 70-week countdown is exclusively calibrated for your people and your holy city. National Israel and Jerusalem, Daniel 9:24. When Israel rejected the presentation of the Messiah on Palm Sunday, their national stopwatch was paused and they were subsequently scattered across the face of the earth. We are currently living in that historical intermission, an era where the focus shifted from a localized geographic sanctuary to a global multi-ethnic entity, the Church. Given the literal wording of the prophecy and the undisputed historical sequence, this interpretation does not represent an emotional assumption or an afterthought. It is the only elegant solution to a genuine chronological problem. The question for the rational mind is not simply, do you believe it? The far better question is, what alternative hypothesis can possibly account for this degree of data precision? A syllogism premise 1, the locked vault proof. If an ancient document is proven to be locked in a vault hundreds of years before an event takes place, you can mathematically rule out cheating or fake predictions written after the fact. Premise 2, the exact coordinate rule vague predictions can be twisted to mean anything. But when a text gives a precise day-by-day countdown connected to real calendar dates, it acts like a passcode that only has one correct solution. Conclusion: the external mind. So, if the ancient Hebrew calendar hits the exact day of an execution and correctly details the fall of an empire years in advance, humans didn't write the code alone. An intelligence outside of time was directing it. Luke 19:41-43. Now as he drew near, he saw the city and wept over it, saying, If you had known, even you, especially in this your day, the things that make for your peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes. For days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment around you, surround you and close you in on every side, and level you and your children within you to the ground, and they will not leave in you one stone upon another, because you did not know the time of your visitation.